Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining today. I have the pleasure this morning of speaking with Dr. Peter Lightfoot. He's the technical advisor for Garibaldi Resources. Peter, joining us from Sudbury today. How are you, sir?
Hey, very well, thank you, John. Nice to speak to you.
Yeah, really appreciate you coming out and taking the time to speak with us and helping educate everybody on the system at Nickel Mountain and talking about some of these exciting results that have come up recently. So I think to start off, I imagine most of the viewers will be quite familiar with you, but for anyone that's not familiar with you, maybe somebody newer looking at the Garibaldi story and might not be familiar with your background, can you just share with the audience your background in nickel sulfide exploration and what your background, education, etc.?
Yeah, well, John, I started my life in nickel mineralization many years ago, actually at the University of Toronto, and the person who first got me interested in the whole topic of nickel mineralization was Tony Aldrich, the famous guru of nickel sulfides. I worked with Tony for many years, and it included quite a lot of work on the Norilsk mineral system, where we developed a model for the open system evolution of the magma through a magma conduit and the formation of the ore deposits. And that kind of set me up then eventually to join industry. I joined Inco, and the principal reason I wanted to join Inco was to work on Voisey's Bay, and that was another magma conduit to work on. So I'd kind of been through quite a few different mineral systems globally, but with a very strong focus on nickel. And then in 2016, I was fortunate to start as a technical advisor with Garibaldi, and it's kind of really an eye-opening experience to see the developments and understanding as we continue the exploration effort there.
So you've been at this for more than 20 years, right, Peter? It's safe
to
say you know
more
a thing
than 30
or two
years,
about,
I hate to think.
you know a thing or two about nickel, if we could put that succinctly.
Yeah, I've been around a lot of different nickel deposits on the planet, yeah.
Oh, that's good. Okay. So when it comes to Garibaldi specifically, I believe it was 2017, there was lots of talk about the Magma highway and how the deposit had formed. And in 2019 and 2020, some of the exploration holes, basically, outside of the main E&L zone, the company had intersected what they're now calling the Eastern Extension Zone. Mm-hmm. And from what I understand, this has validated your theory about how the nickel sulfide system at Nickel Mountain works. Can you talk about that and how the Eastern Extension Zone sort of validates that theory? And I know you have a sort of a conceptual diagram made up, so maybe Wes, if you could bring that up, it would be a slide. Let's start with slide number 1 first, Wes. Can bring that up. So this was just put out by the company, as you know, Peter, and it's identified clearly that Eastern Extensional Zone. You can see what the company drilled earlier at E&L up above the upper and lower discovery zones. So Peter, let's talk about how this new drilling validates the model that you had kind of had in mind the whole time.
Okay, absolutely. Well, what you're looking at here is effectively a slice through Nickel Mountain, a vertical slice. We call it in geology a long section. You can see right up at surface is the original discovery at E&L of disseminated sulfide, and we refer to that as the E&L intrusion. In fact, all of the purple unit is the E&L intrusion. The mineral zones close to surface are either disseminated sulfides, or they are semi-massive sulfides at the contact, or massive sulfides that have been injected into surrounding country rocks. In the case of the near-surface domain, that includes the upper and lower discovery zone. As we drilled more and more into the roots of E&L, we discovered that it had a more dike-like body underlying it. And in many places, this dike-like body of E&L Gabbro cross-cuts through a series of other types of gabbros. And then as we kept on going, we recognized through some very, very detailed structural studies that the whole system had a more or less east-west trend and plunged towards the east at around about 45 degrees. And this basically was the rationale for putting a hole into the eastern extensional zone. The first hole, we hit a series of E&L rock, recent drilling as well, additional intervals with very similar rock types as well as mineralization. So the whole concept that this was not just kind of a tiny little closed off plug of gabbro at surface was validated by the drilling. The original model we put together was what we referred to as a magma highway. It was a route by which magma goes from depth to surface through a pipe-like structure, probably in a fault zone. These pipes are effectively very much what we search for in the world of nickel exploration, and E&L is a very classic example. It was very satisfying to understand E&L and then make the prediction and discover the extension zone to the east and down plunge.
And Wes, can you bring up slide number 3 for us? So what we're looking at here, Peter, you put this together. This is basically a conceptual model of what we saw earlier. Obviously what we saw earlier was the actual drill results, or sort of an interpretation of the drill results. This is just more of a simplistic model of what we're seeing. You know, we were just seeing a small part of a much larger system, correct?
Yeah, exactly. This is absolutely critical. The parts that are shown in the somewhat darker grays, reds and yellows are reasonably well established from drilling, whereas the rest of the system in the lighter shades are a conceptual interpretation. Basically, the model we developed for E&L follows the models that exist for other magmatic sulfide deposits on the planet. There are a wide range of nickel deposits that are associated with pipe-like structures. Examples include Karatunka in China, Sakatti in Finland, Eagle in Michigan. You can probably go through about 10 different deposits of this type. And this was the concept we put together for Nickel Mountain. What we're looking at here is effectively a pipe along which magma can flow from depth to surface, which is shown by the red arrow. It's an open system pipe, so it basically allows you to transport material into these bulge domains. In 3D, it's kind of a little bit difficult to visualize in 2D from this diagram, but in 3D, you can kind of imagine that you're looking at a section through a snake, an anaconda, if you like, with maybe it's got 3 different animals and it's got to different sizes, and these are the bulges along the magma pipe. The key thing about these types of pipe is that they are transportation paths for magma. They're also a way of getting more metal into the system, and because they have variations in thickness, they have edges which are quite thin and thicker core domains, which are shown in the pink color. The places where the magma is transported from one bulge domain to another are basically the locations where you would expect more massive mineralization to accumulate. And that's exactly what we see at the bottom of the E&L chamber, which is the one closest to surface. And as we go progressively deeper down the system, these pinch points between the different bulges are great places to go and search for massive sulfide mineralization. So if you take that image and you look at it in cross-sectional view, AB is a section through it. You can basically see it's a kind of a squashed-looking hose pipe, and at the tail end of it, there's a bit of a fin. We refer to that fin as a bladed dike, and the main domain of the intrusion we refer to as a conduit. And this is the mechanism by which the magma is transported. So this is basically our working model at the moment for the E&L system, and it's very much driving our exploration effort.
So that's an interesting theory. So, and this picture that we see at the top, Wes, you might as well keep it up because we'll probably be referring to it quite a bit. It's showing that originally the E&L chamber that's been drilled in 2017, 2018, et cetera, that's been eroded away, right? We're only actually seeing part of that.
Absolutely, yeah. The ice age has done a pretty good job. Even more recent glaciation has taken quite a bit off the top of the mountain, and so the original shape of the chamber, it's dashed in as a possible shape there, but we don't know what's gone. But it's pretty clear that at some point this had to exit towards the surface or into some sort of major high-level chamber. But given the fact this was emplaced into the Hazelton Formation during the Jurassic, you weren't too far below the surface, so it's more than likely it came to surface.
Okay, and this chamber, that E&L chamber, could have been actually much larger than we know it today. Yeah,
exactly. Okay. And any one of these chambers, I've pretty well shown them here as similar in size, but they can vary enormously in size. They don't have to all be the same.
So the importance of this, the bladed dike, it's almost like a fin on a shark, I guess, right? Or a fin on a fish. The importance of that would be if you're drilling and you encounter sort of a thinner section. The fins, correct me if I'm wrong, are partially mineralized, or they have the same signature, like the same rock texture as the rest of the magma chamber.
They're very similar to the main intrusion. They sometimes are a little bit more high magnesium in composition. They do tend to contain disseminated sulfides. The sulfide mineralization doesn't always have as high metal concentration as the sulfides in the main bulges. But the fins are a very useful indicator of proximity to the main channelway.
Okay, so if for example, Garibaldi was drilling and they sort of drilled through a very thin section of this E&L Gabbro, they could potentially know, okay, we're into a fin right now, and we should be looking for one of these bulges sort of nearby. Would that
absolutely, yes. I think you're talking on the scale of a few hundred meters. So given you try and position your holes so they cross the system, it's a very useful indicator of whether or not you're nearby.
Okay. So when it comes to actual deposition of the massive sulfides, because I mean that's the golden goose here, the golden egg that the goose laid. The massive sulfides have the most economic value. They are deposited. Can you go into where you would expect to find them deposited based on your theory?
I wonder, the best way to actually look at this is actually in the real section, which I think is the next one in the slide deck.
Wes, can we go to slide 4? There we go. Perfect.
Yeah. So this is basically the schematic of the geology. We're no longer dealing with magma chambers and magma conduits. We're actually dealing with solidified igneous rock, and we refer to these as intrusions. The E&L intrusion, you can actually see the distribution very cartoonishly shown in as a contact zone of more massive mineralization we refer to as the northwest zone. Throughout much of the E&L intrusion, with the exception of a little meniscus of material on the top north side, comprises a taxitic gabbro or an orbicular textured gabbro with disseminated sulfides. There is mineralization wrapping around the northeast side. We refer to that as the Cascade Zone. And then there's also mineral in the country rocks in front of it, which are basically superimposed onto the chamber here in the form of the upper discovery and the lower discovery zone. The lower discovery zone is really the most abundant and thick intervals of mineralization at E&L, and these were probably injected out of the base of the chamber into the surrounding country rocks. There's a good bet the magmatic sulfide accumulated from the magma in this particular location, and either during late phases of magmatism or post-magmatic activity, the mineralization was injected out into the surrounding country rocks. So the place you want to really look is where these bulges turn into tails. And you can see the level of drilling in the eastern extension zone. We don't think we've quite got down to the bulges yet, but there is surely a target sitting at the bottom of this this bulge, and that's what we'd look for. And as time goes by, we'd continue to try and identify other bulges as we go towards the bottom of Nickel Mountain.
Right. So with the recognizing that the flow is going to move from basically the bottom right to the top left, you're looking for the flow would come through those narrow pipes. I don't know if you'd call them dikes, if that's the right word. And then you get, as the flow came into that much larger chamber, it would create turbulence. You'd have a drop in velocity because now the same amount of mass is going through a much larger area. And is that correct then, Peter?
That's essentially absolutely correct. The mineralization accumulates there simply because it's dense. The density of massive sulfide is around 5 grams per cc, whereas the density of a silicate magma is about 3. And so at some point, the sulfides will tend to accumulate. And the place they're going to accumulate is towards the bottom of these chambers and towards the entry point of the dike-like domain, the bladed dike, if you like, into the main chamber.
Okay, so that's the really, you're targeting the sweet spot is to try and find basically the, I don't know if you call it the bottom or the right edge of each of these bulges where you know that it's moving from sort of a narrow area into a much wider area, and that's your highest odds of finding the massive sulfide.
That's the highest odds, yeah, exactly.
And so earlier, Peter, you mentioned that the massive sulfides were sort of squeezed into the Hazelton, the sedimentary rock. Is there a reason that happens, that you get can you explain how the sulfides would actually inject themselves into that?
Well, there are 2 types of country rock in the area of the E&L intrusion. One is what appears to be possibly an older gabbro. We're not absolutely sure about this yet. We call it the Nickel Mountain gabbro. It is a very boring equigranular gabbro that contains no magmatic sulfide, but it has somewhat gradational contacts with the E&L gabbro. The gabbros appear to broadly cross-cut it, and they also cross-cut the sediments. The equigranular gabbros are very massive, and there's no sign of massive sulfides penetrating out into those simply because they don't crack very well, whereas the sediments are layered. They are very brittle and easily break up under stress. And so any opening made during tectonic modification of the system would open up a space into which the massive sulfide could be squeezed out of the E&L intrusion into the country rock.
So the massive sulfides themselves, they wouldn't be hard or crystalline, they'd be actually mobile enough to be squeezed into there?
Yeah, they are possibly mobilized as melts. I'm not absolutely sure of the answer to that. It's possible tectonic activity was taking place during the emplacement of this pipe. It's also possible that the mineralization was just remobilized from a location at the contact into these cracks, basically behaving in a somewhat plastic way.
Okay, so, all right, that's interesting. Now, when it comes to exploring, I guess the exploration philosophy going forward, now that the company has discovered the Eastern Extension Zone, and given this model that we're looking for here, obviously the logical pathway would be we need to find the more, I guess, further east, the extent of how big this latest bulge, the Eastern Extension Zone, exists, and then we would expect that's where we'd expect to find the potential massive sulfide target.
Yeah, that's right. So there are a number of different opportunities as you follow the broad rake of this pipe. One is to keep on finding zones of the really high quality, high grade massive sulfide mineralization. Some of the material in the lower discovery zone at E&L is amongst the best 10% of grade of magmatic type sulfide mineralization on the planet. So finding more of this stuff at the pinches would be really good news. The other opportunity is to find zones of more heavy disseminated sulfide associated with large bulges in the chamber. These materials might be standalone targets, or they might just dilute the massive sulfide with a more acceptable material in terms of recovering metal value. The exploration approach we have, okay, we've got the broad rake of the system, but we can't just pop holes anywhere into this. We have to be very, very scientifically precise about where we put the holes. We'll optimize their distribution, so we are able to survey those holes with geophysical tools that tell us if there are conductive sulfides nearby. We'll also position the holes in order to maximize our chance of going through the main conduit. So into the future, we're obviously exploring at the moment beyond the eastern extension zone, and we've already extended the length of the intrusion from a very small 200-meter wide zone at surface to almost 700 meters. And my expectation is we'll continue to grow this system if it's not faulted off at depth.
And you mentioned a second ago talking about the disseminated sulfides. The fact that the Gabbro, the E&L Gabbro that you've encountered in the eastern extensional zone is mineralized, was that a given, or was that actually a bonus? Like, would you always expect to find that to be mineralized, or was the fact that it's mineralized here, is that just kind of a pleasant surprise?
You know, when we explored down plunge from E&L, we were delighted just to find the E&L intrusion. We found the right rocks. The bonus was we found disseminated sulfide, E&L type sulfides in the eastern extension zone. And we found some domains of massive sulfide at the edges of the system as well. We still haven't got any significant intervals there, but as we move forward, that obviously will be the focus of our work.
Right. So if we encounter more of these chambers, or the chambers get larger, the fact that they're mineralized, I mean, that represents, this is adding tonnage, right? I mean, you're getting disseminated sulfide in the larger areas, and towards the edges, like you said, the semi-massive sulfide, and then squeezed into the country rock predominantly is the massive sulfide.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. When it comes to the scale of these zones, Wes, I don't know if you can, maybe it's better explained if we go back to slide 1, because that might explain this, show the scale a little bit better. Is the size of the magma chamber, what's the relevance? Can you speak to, if we have a much larger magma chamber, say the eastern extensional zone ends up being substantially larger than the E&L zone. Based on the scale that you've drawn here, it looks like it's shaping up to be larger. Is there something to be said for, the larger the chamber, what that could possibly mean for the, the eventual massive sulfide mineralization that you're looking to find? Can you speak to that, Peter?
This is quite a complicated question. There are nickel deposits in pipes of this type around the planet where the volume of the pipe is exceptionally small. In fact, right now, the volume of the whole E&L intrusion is almost comparable to some of the intrusions with known ore deposits actually sitting in them in other locations on the planet. So size is not everything. A small intrusion is actually something you look for. Within that intrusion, if you've got a larger domain within it, there's a chance that there will be more disseminated sulfide caught up in it. Simply volumetrically, there's more material to host the mineralization. And if that disseminated sulfide is able to accumulate out into the base of these larger bulges, there is a possibility you'll get more mineralization at the edges and concentrated into the margins. It's not a complete one-to-one, but we obviously are encouraged by the scale of the eastern extension part of the system.
Okay, and speaking of scale, I guess if keeping I don't think any of the slides really show this, but correct me if I'm wrong. Like, so far, where to the extent that the company has drilled, we're only about in the top 1/3 of Nickel Mountain, right? So there's potentially a lot of room for more of these chambers as you follow them down the mountain, which I'm assuming would be the philosophy, is to first of all try and identify the higher grade mineralization at the eastern extensional zone, and once that would be done, and then the next logical step is to follow and look for the next bulge, right? In the
that's right. Yeah, we effectively could carry on drilling from the top of the mountain and drill very long holes to follow this system, but we'd be drilling effectively down the plunge of the system. It would be far better to drill from the side of the mountain or from from other platforms and cross it at different locations. The perfect geometry exists here to do this because this system is plunging down the mountain, not too far away from the surface, and so we are quite well positioned to do that type of exploration. It's also possibly not within too great a distance of being able to detect mineralization with surface EM methods, and so that's certainly something we're also looking into applying on the side of the mountain.
Mm-hmm. And conceptually, we could definitely have more. There's lots of room, right? There's still 2/3 of the way down the mountain to go that's unexplored. That there could
Absolutely,
be more.
yeah. The pipe is continuing to go through Hazelton Formation and Nickel Mountain Gabbro, if indeed it isn't faulted off. Below that, it could go into the volcanic assemblage. Really, we're in unknown ground. There's no concept of what happens at the moment as we go much deeper. But let's focus on the bit we can more easily test at the moment.
Right. On that note, though, is there any way to predict how many more bulges there might be, or how large they would be, or is that a complete unknown at this point?
To me, it's an unknown. I think one of the things that is interesting, though, is that this thing actually was placed into a crack that is effectively a fault zone. It may not be the only one. There could be a whole series of these pipes along a fault plane, and obviously that's one of the key things we're doing in terms of a more regional exploration program at Nickel Mountain.
Okay, so that, I mean, obviously that would be really exciting to find more of these.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's talk about, we've talked about the E&L Gabbro, and I know in the chat that you and I have had before this interview, we talked about the E&L Gabbro being a very easily recognizable rock. When you see it, it's got a very distinct texture, it's got a very distinct chemical signature. The sulfides have a very distinct texture. Let's maybe talk about that for a bit and how that helps.
Yeah, sure.
And Wes, maybe bring up slide number 2 that it shows some of the examples of the rock.
Yeah, so we've grown a level of expertise at recognizing rocks that belong to E&L. We can do this not just because we can see sulfide mineralization in the rock, but there are also textural variants of the rock that are really obvious. If your counter was made of these types of rock in the kitchen, preferably without sulfide because it would oxidize, but the textures of these rocks would be quite amazing in a polished slab. And we often cut these rocks to try and identify these textures. In hole 19 at 96 meters, you can see a really nice example of one of these sub-rounded textures. We call it an orbicular texture, and the rock is very variable in texture. This is a feature we refer to as a taxitic texture. So this is a very characteristic rock. Another rock that's quite recognizable is the olivine peroxenite. This is a more primitive rock that's been encountered more in the roots of the E&L system and in the eastern extension chamber. Eastern extension intrusion. It consists of often fine-grained sulfides, but the two principal minerals are olivine and pyroxene. Again, this is quite a recognizable rock. Either one of these without sulfide would absolutely be indicative of an E&L type. As we get into the more heavy mineralization, you can see two examples in the bottom left-hand side in hole 47 and 53 of orbicals from equivalent roughly to what you're seeing in hole 19, caught up with sulfide in between or entirely floating in sulfide. And the other rocks, which obviously are a giveaway, are the massive sulfides, and those are the two examples there of semi-massive and massive as you go to the apogee of the style of mineralization seen in veins. So these are the rocks we look for. We refer broadly to these types of rocks as olivine gabbros. Sometimes we call them Melagabbro because we're unsure about what their composition is, but we do know that they're particularly mafic. They typically contain a lot more iron magnesium minerals, and so these rocks, when we identify them in reconnaissance field programs, they're very positive and good news from the point of view of continued search for a new zone of like E&L. This year, we're fortunate that the team of geologists working west of Nickel Mountain identified some of these orbicular textures, taxitic textures, as well as disseminated sulfides in float boulders that quite clearly cannot come from E&L. They're almost on the other side of a cirque, and so they would have a hard time to jump across the topography and land on the other side. Looks like they come from somewhere. We still have to identify whether this is covered in scree or maybe it's under the ice field to the north.
Was that mineralized discovery, Peter? Is that roughly on trend of what this current?
Very approximately. As you go a kilometer away from a relatively 600-meter wide trend, the uncertainty increases, but broadly it appears to be on the trend. These are float boulders, so we don't exactly know where they originate, but they can't come from too far to the north simply because they wouldn't be able to roll down the hill.
Right. So this is definitely a target worth following up on.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
And we continue to search for other examples of Melagabbro across the property.
In this slide, the top right, the olivine pyroxenite, correct me if I'm wrong, but you did not encounter that rock in the top magma chamber, the top bulge, the E&L zone.
Yeah, that's right.
The first time that you've seen this has been in the eastern extensional zone. Can we read anything into that? The fact
the thickest unit is in the eastern extension. There are areas of the blades below E&L, the dike-like bodies that contain olivine pyroxenite with disseminated sulfide. The very thick unit to the east is very interesting. It's pointing to a significant differentiation of the intrusion here, and where you see a much wider range of rock compositions hosting the mineralization, that's another quite encouraging piece of information. It means there's time for the rocks to crystallize to produce a variety of different rock compositions. I find it hard to read anything into it because I don't know its exact geometry or distribution at this point in time, but I'm just encouraged to see such a wide range of rock types.
Right, and this type of rock type, would you have seen it at Norilsk as well? Like, are these some of the clues?
The rocks at Norilsk are somewhat different. The most olivine-rich rocks are a little different in characteristics to this one, but broadly speaking, the range in rock types and magnesium concentrations are indicative of a very differentiated intrusion, and probably occupy a similar range to some of the intrusions in the Norilsk setting.
And just for maybe the non-technical members of the viewers, when you talk about differentiation, can you just quickly explain what you mean by that?
Okay, that's a long conversation in itself. But basically, you take a magma, and as you crystallize that magma, you will form silicate minerals, which will either just float in the magma if they're neutral density, or if they're slightly denser, they'll settle out and be concentrated. As they're concentrated, they'll make rocks that are more ferromagnesium in composition. They'll be more like the olivine pyroxenites. The residual liquid that's left over after the formation of those rocks is going to be more feldspathik in composition and crystallize a lot more plagioclase feldspar. It's going to make something closer to a gabbro in composition. And so that process by which the magma produces a wide range of rock compositions is referred to as igneous differentiation.
Okay, and correct me if I'm wrong, in the empirical evidence, when you see differentiation, that's associated with mineralization in a nickel-sulphide deposit, correct?
The best deposits, the best rocks to be working in are rocks that have a wide range of different compositions. If I had a little intrusion that was made just of one rock type with no variability in it whatsoever, I would submit that its nickel potential would be significantly reduced.
Okay, and we have the opposite here.
We have the opposite, yes.
Okay. The news release mentioned Chonolith. Just for clarity for people that might be wondering what that means, when you refer to
Yeah.
Chonolith, is that simply the system that we've been looking at? Wes, if you go to slide 3 for us. Is this whole system, would you term this whole thing the Chonolith, or can you give a
Yeah,
little bit of clarity
geologists have a wonderful way of creating words to describe rocks, and there's almost a vast number of different descriptions of intrusion form. We have lopoliths, and we have cactoliths, and we have conoliths. Conoliths are just effectively open system magma conduits. This is exactly what you're seeing here. The term conolith was effectively created to describe this type of system.
Okay, so we've been talking about, and I've obviously been mispronouncing it, but Chonolith. The whole time we've been talking about this conduit, we're talking about the Chonolith. So if anyone's wondering, okay, what that meant in the news release, then now we know. It's just the technical word for this, the series of chambers. Okay, and the Chonolith even comprises the smaller dikes in between each of the larger bulges.
It's just a connected system network of a network pipe of through which the melt could travel.
Okay. Is there any differentiation between the term Chonolith and the term dike?
A Chonolith can effectively be a dike. There is effectively a range. In a situation like this where you've kind of got these blades on the edge, you would normally refer to that as a bladed dike or a bladed pipe. If the dike was very extensive and there were more than one zone of material of bulges where material was transported through it, you could end up with a situation with multiple different mineral zones in one dike-like structure. That's probably what's happening in the Reed Brook zone at Voisey's Bay, very similar to that type of morphology. You could generalize and say all of these are conoliths, but not normally one starts to refer to them more by the geometry than just that effective description of an open system magma conduit.
Okay. Peter, I know in the past there's been a lot of talk about a feeder system or quote unquote the feeder that fed this system. Can you speak to how that concept of a feeder applies to what we're seeing here? Are we actually seeing individual areas being fed, or is this kind of coming from a much larger system?
So in effect, every one of those bulges, the bottom of it, and the point where it joins into that bladed dike, you could refer to that as a feeder, and there would be feeders, but the whole thing is feeding magma through it. It is a feeder conduit, feeding magma from depth to the surface. It's kind of sometimes used as a descriptor for a specific location in intrusion, where it narrows down. I prefer to call that the keel of the intrusion, or the junction point between a dike and an intrusive body. The genetic implications of an open system feeder are just very general to the overall system.
Okay. I know in the news release, and you've kind of touched on it already, it mentioned that GGI has identified Melagabbro about 1.3 kilometers east, and as far away as I think 12 kilometers to the northeast.
Yeah, that's right.
Can you touch on the importance of this Melagabbro as maybe being a pathfinder, or what significance should people attribute to that?
So this more mafic gabbro is atypical of the Nickel Mountain gabbro, and it is closer in composition to the composition of the E&L system. We also look at other aspects of the detailed geochemistry. There are certain elements that are very diagnostic of an E&L type magma. For example, the ratios of rare earth elements are very indicative of E&L, and the Nickel Mountain gabbro is very different in composition to E&L. When we find a signal of a Melagabbro that also has the geochemical signature of E&L, we start to think, could this be another domain, another conduit in another portion of the part of the property? We've certainly found some very encouraging rocks that look like they belong to a E&L type intrusion, but at the moment we still haven't found any evidence of mineralization, and we certainly haven't found the orbicular textures or any disseminated sulfides beyond the boulders that we've located to the west of E&L.
So, okay, so there's potential there, but more work needed to identify
More work,
if there's
yeah.
anything to get excited about.
Yeah, that's right. We look at a lot of factors here. We use WorldView satellite imagery to identify Gabbro rocks. We combine the signal of magnetics and the electromagnetic response. So there are a number of different factors that come into play in terms of going and evaluating these different locations.
Okay. Peter, I want to bring up, while I have you here, this has been a theory that's been put forward by some people that, you know, maybe weren't too fond of the company, and they've talked about the fact that the E&L zone was formed as a very small Pluton intrusion. It was a one-off event. Is there any commentary you can provide on that thesis and whether what we've seen to date in the drilling and the model that we've just talked about during this interview, can you talk about that theory? And
the first point I'd like to make is that if you actually look at the volume of the E&L intrusion, there is far too much metal in mineralization there to have been formed by segregation of immiscible sulfide from the observed volume of magma. The mass balance doesn't work. And when we first recognized that, we went, this has to be an open system. That is essentially how we explain the composition of the Norilsk ores, is through an open system enrichment. That was at the very heart of the papers that I wrote with Tony Aldrich on this subject. So E&L is clearly an example of an open system, and the fact that then we go ahead and actually drill underneath it and find dike-like bladed dyke extensions of it, and then into another chamber towards the east is yet further evidence. It's hard to think that magma can just materialize it from nowhere. It has to actually be transported into the system from somewhere, and so following that pathway of transportation is very critical. The other point here is, yes, it's small, but many other intrusions that host magmatic sulfide systems are small. The Norilsk Chonoliths are exceptionally small in volume. Karatunka is small. If you look at the Eagle intrusion, Eagle and Eagle East, the actual scale of the intrusions is very small. Double Eagle in the Ring of Fire is quite a small intrusion, and that's another pipe-like example. And Sakati in Finland is a classic example. All of these volumetrically, okay, they may be just slightly bigger than E&L, but as we continue to expand the scale of the pipe, I'm expecting it to fall in roughly the same range.
Okay. Speaking of Norilsk, correct me if I'm wrong, finding these bladed dykes and stuff, that's a character you find that at Norilsk as well, right?
Yeah. The different settings have blades which are different lengths. For example, in the Voices Bay Reed Brook zone, the dike is semi-continuous to almost totally continuous, and the domains of mineralization are related to pinch zones in the dike. It's a very, very wide series of blades. At Chalnak in Russia, the extent of the blades can be very extensive. They're actually referred to as the apophyses, and instead of being vertical, they actually occupy the flanks, probably because the intrusion was injected at a relatively shallow level into the sedimentary rocks. So it's a characteristic feature. It's not present in every example of a magma conduit, but it's certainly something that is commonly observed.
Okay. So just sort of in closing, I think we've covered off things nicely, but just from an excitement standpoint, are you encouraged and by what you've seen so far, the fact that your theory has been validated? You know, I believe you had projected that if you moved down to the east that you would find this, and in fact the drilling has verified that or validated that.
Exactly.
How exciting is it to have your theory validated? And
it's very good, and you know, my hope here is as we continue to drill there, we're going to hit the massive sulfide that's sitting towards the base of one of these next pods down. So I'm really looking forward to the next phase of work we're doing there. I'm also very excited by the other discovery of E&L type float boulders on the property, and I continue to think that the broad footprint of the Nickel Mountain Gabbro remains very prospective for exploration. And so we will stay the course with this and do as much work as we can this summer, and then get ourselves set up for a very exciting year next year.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what we find as the the eastern extension zone is kind of delineated and figure out the geometry. And yeah, and I think your the pictures that you provided here really, I think, should really help people graphically visualize this is the area we're going for, and understand. Hopefully this video has helped people understand sort of the formation of why we would be looking for the massive sulfides at the sort of the eastern extension of this extensional zone that we're in. So appreciate your time, Peter. Really great chatting with you. Thanks for educating everybody on this topic, and look forward to having you on another time, maybe with as more information comes to surface with some more of the drilling.
Yeah, John, I appreciate the opportunity of talking to folks who are interested in Garibaldi. It's also a real pleasure to be able to present some of the work that's been carried out by the team working at Nickel Mountain. It is a very difficult operational place to be, and the team has worked exceptionally hard to bring us to the point we're at.
Okay. All right. Well, in the meantime, stay safe, and I'm sure we'll be talking to you soon.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Okay.